Cultural landscapes and archaeological landscapes logically overlap with each other because they both refer to landscapes, but with different perspectives about the events and processes that have occurred in these places. In this video, I propose to acknowledge and appreciate what distinguishes a cultural landscape apart from an archaeological landscape toward combining these two perspectives together productively. Generally speaking, people always have engaged with their culture, history, and language in close connection with the landscapes where they live. In these respects, cultural landscapes are the places where people learn, experience, and create diverse aspects of their personal lives and cultural heritage. Some of the best known examples of cultural landscapes are the places with traditional cultural place names. Often these place names are linked with stories about what happened here in the past. As human beings, we all learn about the histories and traditions of the places where we live, work, and travel. In this way, we can learn about how certain landmarks and landscapes came to exist, and we can learn about how people can or should live or behave. The histories, lessons, and traditions continue from one generation to the next, inevitably with some variation and interpretation. Typically, the traditions can continue with the most stability when they can be shared and experienced through the same language of their origin. Many of the elements, especially about place names and traditions, make the most sense only within their original language. Whenever people interact with a cultural landscape, especially when this interaction is part of an active learning process, then the actual action occurs within the present day of a person's life. Accordingly, a modern-day bias or view of presentism can affect the way that people think about the past generally and regard their landscapes specifically. In most cases, the traditions about cultural landscapes have changed through time in order to remain relevant for each next generation of people. Mostly, the older aspects of a landscape retain the least amount of relevance, and they may be remembered in vague terms about a distant past that could have happened some years ago, some hundreds of years ago, or some thousands of years ago. The later aspects tend to be remembered or reinforced in the most detail and prominence within modern life because these aspects are the most immediately accessible and relatable for people today. The later age aspects of a landscape often are detectable on the present-day ground surface and visible among the present-day landforms. Furthermore, coinciding with written and unwritten histories, traditions about cultural place names, and clues within a local language. This convergence of the most accessible lines of evidence can reinforce the later-aged aspects of a cultural landscape. The older-aged aspects of a landscape tend to be hidden from view due to changing sea level, transformations of landforms, and buildup of multiple sedimentary layers. Moreover, these ancient contexts mostly are remembered in vague terms about a distant past that was significantly older than the more accessible aspects of surface visible elements in a landscape. In my professional work, archaeology must involve looking at the past in chronological order, such as when portraying how a landscape has changed through time in its natural history and cultural history. Each time period can be presented in its natural order and in its own terms, in total portraying an archaeological landscape chronology, or a unified sequence of natural and cultural landscape history. When I look at a landscape as an archaeologist, then I look through the present-day setting, and instead I look for the clues about the most ancient time periods that could be represented here. In most cases, I need to excavate deep beneath the present-day ground in order to reveal the older layers. The findings expose a picture that is significantly different from the modern-day scene. Moreover, the findings about each layer of time in total portray the archaeological landscape in a chronological order. You may have noticed that my approach with an archaeological landscape avoids the potential issues of bias when looking at the past from the present. This approach maximizes the strengths of archaeology, thereby exposing the factual material evidence in its own terms within a measured chronological order. One example in my work has been at Ritidian or Litexen, currently within the Guam National Wildlife Refuge, where the archaeological record extends back all the way to the time when people first ever lived in the region, at least as early as 1500 BC. My research has shown how the physical landforms, coastal ecology, and freshwater resources have changed through time, and how people have created different housing patterns, rock art in caves, and assortments of pottery, other artifacts, and food middens within each separate time period. In other words, the natural history and cultural history have been coordinated together for a holistic understanding of landscape evolution, now included as part of the experience of people who visit the place with a self-guided tour or with the official guided tours by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. All of these aspects contribute to the knowledge of the archaeological landscape and the experience of the cultural landscape. I should clarify that cultural landscapes always coincide with recognizable places or landmarks. The exact points or mapped boundaries could be interpreted differently, but the general parameters always can be recognized and depicted, at least vaguely, on a map. The meaning or significance of a cultural landscape could be variable from one person to another, as well as from one generation to another. A cultural landscape could involve stories or lessons about how people think, how people should behave in a society, and how people relate with each other during their social lives. These behavioral and cognitive aspects almost always are missing from the material archaeological record of a landscape. Instead, an archaeological landscape involves the locations and shapes of landforms and houses, the inventories of artifacts, and the compositions of food middens during each separate time period. An archaeological landscape always refers to real physical materials and features in mapped locations, and each layer or time period of the landscape can be measured in terms of its age in a chronological order. When I portray an archaeological landscape chronology, then the chronological framework allows for an archaeological landscape to be compatible and coordinated with a cultural landscape. I can identify the parts that potentially coincide with each other. As you might imagine, some but not all of the points of evidence actually coincide, but the chronological framework allows for overall compatibility. In contrast to my approach, many of my colleagues prefer to look at the past from the present. In their approach, a cultural landscape serves as the primary way of looking at the past. The research questions tend to involve the social, behavioral, and cognitive aspects of a cultural landscape that are attested in historical references and cultural traditions, yet they are absent from the archaeological evidence. Typically, this mode of research acknowledges that surface visible site ruins and later age artifacts relate to the general time period of the traditions as known in the cultural landscape. Different perspectives about the past, of course, are valid, whether looking at the past from the present or revealing a multi-layered past in chronological order. Knowing about these differences can allow for cultural landscapes and archaeological landscapes to enhance each other. What are your thoughts and experiences with these issues? As always, thank you for watching. I will see you in the next video.